Hey guys, it's Brie here from Blossom and Branch Farm, and today I'm back in the greenhouse to talk to you about algae. Now, algae is something that happens to the best of us when we're seed starting. Usually you'll see it as this kind of greenish growth on the top of the seedling. Now, if you're growing in soil blocks like we do, you might start to see it actually even growing on the sides of the blocks as well because there's air exposure on all four sides. So is algae something that you should be concerned about when seed starting? Yes and no. Now, if you just have a little bit of it, it's not a big deal, but if it keeps getting worse, it can end up killing your seedlings because it's competing with your seedlings for nutrients and water, so it can kind of suffocate them and starve them to death if it gets too bad. So it is best to try to avoid it if possible. So we're going to talk first about how to avoid it, and then we're going to talk about how to treat it if you already have algae. Let's talk first about how to avoid algae in the first place. The number one thing that I see is overwatering of your seedlings too often. We've talked about this before in the mistakes that you make when you're soil blocking video, but this applies to seed starting in a tray as well. What I see a lot of times is a fear to let your seedlings dry out at all. Now, especially with soil blocking, remember we want to keep them pretty wet until they have germinated. But once we have germination, it's best to let them dry out slightly in between waterings. And this is absolutely true of soil blocks as well. So I want to show you a tray of soil blocks that we have here so that you can see how much we definitely let these dry out. Now you can see these are starting to be a little bit dry and crumbly around the edges. I'll poke this one that doesn't have a seed in it just so that you can see how much it crumbles. It's really very dry, and the seedlings are fine. Do not keep them perpetually moist. Keeping them perpetually moist is part of the cause of green algae on your seedlings. The second best way to prevent algae in the first place is going to be a fan. So I know we often don't like to run fans in our seed starting space because we feel like it dries out our soil blocks or our seed trays, but it is better for the health of the seedling if you can keep a fan. Not only does it help with algae and mold, it also helps with fungus gnat prevention because those fungus gnats aren't able to land and lay eggs in the soil. If there's a fan blowing on them constantly, they're just not strong enough to fight it. So best to have a fan going on your seedlings at all times. That also helps to bulk them up for when you're ready to plant them out so that they're used to being buffeted around by the wind a little bit. So have that fan going in your seed starting space. Another thing that's going to help with the prevention of algae in the first place in your seed starting is going to be bottom watering. Now remember with soil blocks, we always talk about the importance of bottom watering so that we don't disintegrate our soil blocks, but it's important even when we're starting in trays that we water from the bottom instead of on the top of the seedlings. And the reason for that has to do with the algae. It also has somewhat to do with the fungus that can grow, including damping off. Now, if you're soil blocking like I do, you can just bottom water, and you can just bottom water and watch until those blocks start to wicket almost up to the top and then stop. If you can keep the top of that soil block or your seed starting tray dry, that's going to help keep that algae from forming in the first place. The last thing that can lead to increased algae is too hot of a growing space. So if your growing space is on the warmer side, you're going to have more issues with algae. So we actually like to let our seed starting area, our greenhouse, cool off a little bit at night. We find that that helps prevent the algae in the first place. Now there are certain seedlings that just are prone to algae because they are in our seed trays or our soil blocks for a very long time. So usually that's things that are slow growing. For me, that's things like foxglove, lisianthus, snapdragon. Those things tend to be on the slower side, and the slower growing things tend to be prone to algae because they stay small for a long time. And if they're staying small for a long time, what's happening is the area around the soil blocks is getting lots of sun. Algae actually does need sunlight to survive. So this is why we usually don't see algae on bigger seedlings, because those bigger seedlings are actually shading out the soil area underneath. So it's harder for that algae to stay alive. But on those longer growing seedlings like lisianthus, these can be a little bit more prone. So important to try to prevent it if possible. So those are all the things you can do to help prevent algae. Now, if you already have algae growing in your seedlings, what are some things you can do? Let's talk about it. So treatment options include actually suffocating the algae. Sprinkle some cinnamon on top. Then I like to use a little paintbrush to just gently brush it off the seedlings so that it doesn't suffocate out the seedlings themselves or coat the leaves of the seedlings. We don't want that to happen. In addition to dusting on that cinnamon, you can also make a cinnamon tea. We just boil about a gallon of water, we throw in 4 or 5 cinnamon sticks, we let it steep overnight, and then we use that to water any affected seedlings. The antibacterial properties of cinnamon are going to help kill that algae. The other thing that you can do is try sprinkling some vermiculite on after your seeds have germinated. So we've let these ones get a little bit algae for this video so that we could show you what it looks like. And I'm just going to go ahead and sprinkle a little more vermiculite over the top. Now these seedlings are still pretty small, but they're not so small that they're going to get suffocated out by this vermiculite. This is just going to help if you already have that algae growing and your seedlings are big enough to handle a slightly heavier layer of that vermiculite. So we can suffocate it out with either that vermiculite or that cinnamon, but there's another physical trick that you can do that involves a knife, and you just take your knife and you carefully scrape away any soil that has that algae on it. Now obviously you have to be very careful when you're doing this, but that can be a method that many people say works if you are afflicted with algae. Now remember, as your seedlings grow and get bigger and start to shade out the soil underneath, you'll actually see that a lot of the algae goes away on its own. So as long as it's not getting too bad, you don't have to panic over it. But try to avoid it at all if you can. So use those steps. Remember, we want to bottom water. We don't want to keep our seedlings too hot. We want a fan on them and let them dry out in between waterings. Alright guys, if you enjoyed this video and it was helpful for you, please feel free to like and don't forget to subscribe below because that really helps us here on the farm, and we will see you again next time in the greenhouse.